Hey, what's up, y'all? This is B. Cox from The Vault. Now, have you ever wanted to start your own podcast, or you're ready to start one right now, but you're not really sure where to start, what to do, when to do it, how to do it, and what direction to go in? Well, if that's you, look no further. I'm starting a podcast roadmap workshop. Call it the Podcast GPS, where you can learn a proven system that will be both effective and efficient. It will take you from that idea of having your own podcast all the way right up to your podcast launch. I know that the system works because it's the same system and roadmap that I use to grow the two podcasts that I produce and host to a combined 8,000 to 10,000 downloads monthly. That's all starting with no equipment, no mega marketing experience, no sponsors, and no corporate machine backing our efforts or bankrolling our operations. It's a 6-week course, and at the end of the boot camp, you will have all the following: a proven system for creating and planning episodes, an equipment list that aligns with your capabilities and won't break the bank. You'll understand what an RSS feed is and where to host your podcast. You'll have confidence in your new podcast idea. You'll learn how to record, edit, and add music to your show, and also get a launch roadmap to start distributing your podcast everywhere. And what else do you get? You'll have a proven formula for growth and engagement that led us to our success. You'll know exactly what equipment you need that fits your budget. You'll learn time-saving skills to consistently release episodes and plan ahead. You'll also have live weekly sessions with me and real-time answers to your questions in a hands-on live workshop. And you don't need any technical expertise or recording experience to get started. And to sweeten the deal, I'm throwing in the following bonuses for all Podcast GPS enrollees. You'll have access to my royalty-free music library to use within your podcast without worries of copyright claims or expensive lease terms. You'll have my secret episode planning workbook that will help you plan your episodes and set up your recording and production schedule. It makes episode planning super easy. And all course enrollees will be entered into a drawing to win a free USB microphone to get you started. Now, most courses of this caliber are charging thousands of dollars for this content and will get you no closer to starting a podcast than you are right now. But guess what? I'm offering this course at a fraction of the price of those courses. However, I'm only limiting it to 12 open seats, and this course will sell out. Do you want to be left out in the cold or wandering with no idea where to start? If not, you want to act now. And if you're ready to get started and want to start this journey, visit us at vaultclassicpod.com/podcastgps to schedule your free consultation today to talk about starting your journey now.
Welcome to the Vault Podcast, classic music reviews, presented by IV Creative. Now, here's your hosts, B. Cox and the crew.
Greetings and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition of the Vault Podcast, Classic Music Reviews. Presented by IV Creative, it's a perspective of the classics from a fresh point of view. We appreciate you for taking your time and lending your ears to our perspective. You could be anywhere listening to anything, but you're right here with us, so we thank you. With you today is yours truly, B. Cox, and flying solo today, but shout out to the crew. They'll be back next week as we get another album review for you, another classic to review for all of y'all out there. Thank you once again to all of the fans stateside and worldwide. Guys, we are having a bang-up start of the year. Really, thank you all for continuing to spread the word and share the content with people that you know that love hip-hop culture and old-school hip-hop, R&B, and reggae. I'm truly, truly amazed at the number of growth that we've had just in going to what is now our third year of this podcast of the Vault Classic Music Review. So thank you all once again for listening and continuing to spread the word. As you heard in the beginning of the podcast and have heard for a few weeks now, of course, we have a couple of things going on we want to let you know about before we get started. One is our private Facebook community, the Vault Podcast Record Club. On Facebook, it's a private group and a community for those who like and love the show, who love the content and want to talk old school music and just some of the memories we had it back then at that time. It's a private community. The link is in the show notes and description of each show, and you can go down there, check out the show notes, click to join the link in the Facebook group. All you have to do is answer a few questions, agree to the terms, and you're in. I'm telling you, great things we got going on right there. Come and join us right there in the Vault Podcast Record Club, the private community on Facebook. Join it today. We got a lot of great things coming up later on this year for those who are exclusively in the group. And the second thing that we want to mention is our Buy Me a Coffee. Now, if you want to support the show, if you love the content that we're putting out and you want to hear more and you want to see us do more, then you can go to Buy Me a Coffee. The link is as well in the show description and the notes. It's buymeacoffee.com/Vault Classic Pod. You go there, you click on the link. You can support us by buying a coffee, or in this case would be a CD. support in any way that you like, give as often as you like, so that we can continue to open the vault and give you the content that you know and love. As we always say here on The Vault, our motto is hashtag open the vault, hashtag nothing but the classics, or MBTC. And today we have yet another bonus episode and segment. And we did this a couple of weeks ago and it went so well. And I really had a great time doing it. And I got a lot of great feedback from the listeners who listened to it, who reached out after the episode, that I wanted to do another one. So we did Relics of the Past a couple of weeks ago about Record Release Tuesdays. And it really was something that harkened back to my early days as a hip hop fan when I first started buying music and when I got excited about going out to get music, especially for the first time with my own money. So we wanted to do another segment of that, yet another Relic of the Past. And today we're going to talk about a time-honored tradition, especially of those of us who are millennials. They call us elder or geriatric millennials, in my case, being as though I'm in my 40s now. But for those of us who grew up with hip-hop, starting in the 80s and then definitely into the 90s, this is something that all of us know and cherish. And it was a vital component of our hip-hop listening from probably, for those of us in my era, from elementary school all the way up until maybe right around the middle of high school. And it's something that nowadays, that when I think about it, still brings a smile to my face. And I'm talking about none other than this. Everybody remembers what the blank cassette tape was. And for those of us around who were using cassette tapes, I dare to say that it was an integral part of the growth of hip-hop culture and also a big part of our everyday lives and how we listen to music. Now, when we first came up in my era, we grew up listening to music on the radio a lot. And in the in-between times when we were listening to music, a lot of it was done sometimes on our parents' vinyl. Some people actually listen on 8-tracks. I wasn't quite around for the 8-track era, because at that point in time, we had sort of switched over to the next medium, which was cassette tapes. And when I was in elementary school, getting ready, coming up in kindergarten, is when you saw the explosion really of tapes and the medium of tapes, and vinyl was starting to take a little bit of a tumble down in society. And the medium of tapes became very, very popular. Tapes were the medium that we listened to music when we had boom boxes. And for those who know 80s hip-hop culture and 90s hip-hop culture, the boom box was a big part of that as well. And if you wanted to play something out of your boom box, if it wasn't the radio, you had to play a tape. Tapes were how you're going to play the music that you wanted to hear. So the blank cassette tape played a big part in that. And I'll tell you the reason why. And there's a few reasons, these are not all the reasons why the blank cassette tapes were big and what you used them for. But these were some of the biggest ones that we dealt with coming up in the 80s and then also in the 90s. Now, we'll first get into the different types of cassette tapes that people used to use. And there were a lot of different media companies out there. They used, so many different other, came out with different tapes. And you would start out at first that you had the 60-minute tape, 30 minutes on each side. And then they came out a little bit later after that where they made the 90-minute tapes where, albums were a little bit longer and you had to record things that, you needed at least another 30 minutes or so. And that was 45 minutes on each side. So you had Maxwell. Maxwell had the audio cassettes. They had the Maxwell audio cassettes, the UR90s. Then you had TDK. They had the D90s. You had the HF90s from Sony. You also had Memorex, which made tapes before they started making CDs. You had these companies that made these blank tapes. And, what decided what brand of tape you were going to buy was going to be on a couple of different things. One, on the price, and then also the quality. And for those of us who were coming up in the tape era, we all remember that, tapes, they were pretty durable for the most part, but sometimes the tapes got warped or they broke and, if you played it too much. So sometimes you would go with a brand that was a little bit more reliable to you. Now, for me personally, I didn't discriminate upon the blank tapes that I bought. I mean, I was named mostly a Maxwell and a TDK kid, but I remember having a few Sony tapes because that's what my dad used to buy. So, the blank cassette tapes were important. You wanted to make sure that you had a good product and that your tape didn't break or didn't get warped or the tape got eaten up by a boombox or a cassette player, or later on what we had was a Walkman. So you wanted to make sure that you had a good quality cassette tapes. But the things that we use these blank cassette tapes on. Well, first, the one thing that you used to do, what a lot of us did, is before we went out and actually bought radio singles, if we were like, back then when you didn't really have any money, like out in elementary school, I kind of depended on my parents or my older sisters to buy me things before I actually had my own money to go buy things, then you would go out and record songs from the radio. And as wild as that seems now, especially in this streaming era, because we can pretty much call on demand any song that we want to hear for the most part on your choice of streaming service, whether it's Spotify or Apple or Tidal, you can just go and pull it up. And with us, though, you kind of had to wait to hear your song on the radio if you weren't buying music. And if you wanted to hear it and it wasn't coming on all the time on the radio, well, you had to go and record it. Now, what this required was a certain bit of coordination and also skill and reflexes, because sometimes you hear a song on the radio and the DJ would announce the song before it was coming on. But if they were going sort of back-to-back songs and there was maybe a short break for a promo spot where they announced the name of the station, then you would only have a split second only to be able to get up and start recording the song from the radio. So sometimes you would have a situation where the song would start, you would recognize it, and then you'd have to run to the tape deck and go press play and record to make sure you caught it. And sometimes you would get it where you would hear things and you would play it back after you recorded it, and you would probably be missing the first maybe 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 seconds, maybe even longer than that, depending on how far you had to go to the tape deck to actually go press play and record to record your favorite song. So we started doing that and recording our favorite songs from the radio. Now, as a result of this, we started using these tapes, and it sort of created the first kind of mixtapes that we created. And not really talking about the ones that were professionally done. Everybody's neighborhood and everybody's hood and block sort of had somebody that would be a DJ that would, professionally use the records and cut the records and would make a mixtape that would sound clean and professional and everything else. Well, most of us weren't DJs, and most of us didn't have vinyl that we could cut and scratch and be able to transition. We were very unskilled in that respect. So what we kind of had to do is, you had to record something, and then when you knew that that song was getting ready to end and the next song you didn't really want to record, maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't, there would sort of be an abrupt stop to a lot of these. Sometimes you would leave a little bit of blank space in between, and, sometimes you just, let it ride. What you would get was you would have a mixtape of all these different songs that we were recording from the radio. And sometimes they would run songs back to back to back to back to back with no cohesion, no smooth transitions, but you just wanted to be able to capture the song from the radio so that you could recall it and play it again without having to wait for it to come on the radio. Because, let's be real. People used to call and request songs on the radio, but, I didn't really know anyone personally who was calling in on the radio to request a song, at least not at that age, I wasn't. So you would have these mixtapes that we would create, and you would have a row of songs on the radio, and what happens is you would have these tapes, and as you would accumulate these blank tapes in the packs, that would usually come, 3, sometimes maybe even 5 in the pack. The later ones, they had the bigger value packs that came with like 10 in the pack. Then you would see these tapes starting to accumulate, and what you would sit there and label them when you would get the labels to put on the tapes, and you would write on them, and then you would sort of like write a year maybe, or sometimes even a date on them. And so that's what you would use the blank cassette tapes for, to create mixtapes. Now to take it to a little bit of a different direction, what we use blank cassette tapes for, and this really called back to an early medium of me really exploring to be an artist when I was rapping and also producing, that in my very early age when I was in high school, I had a partner of mine, my boy Ideal. Shout out to Dill, my man from high school. We're still friends to this day. We started making music together, and those of us in our group of friends, we would go down in his basement. He had recording equipment. He had a turntable. He had a cassette deck with, the 2 tape decks, like a master stereo and a computer, everything sort of hooked up, really analog back in those days. And we're talking about late 90s. So it was fairly analog based on what we have now and what our capabilities are now to be able to record music. But he would have a ton of blank tapes. So when we would record music at his house, a lot of it was, going and taking a blank tape and recording the beat on it on one blank tape, then playing that blank tape and then recording as the beat is playing, us talking into the microphone. And then you'd have to go to a next take after that and then use another tape to record the next set of vocals. Or if you were slick enough and you could time it up perfectly, then you can get right in between. Maybe if we were doing a song, him and I could get in my verse and then not record over what he was saying. And we did that sometimes because we didn't have a ton of tapes to keep going back and forth and back and forth. So it really was analog. And so people used to do things like that. Also, back in those days, if you were like, starting to dabble in music and do music around, whether it was the folks in the neighborhood or you truly were trying to make a name for yourself and go out there to do shows and really become like an act, as they would say, then you would have your tapes and you would, record those tapes. You would have a tape of songs. The audio quality, obviously, if you weren't doing them in a professional studio, would not be the best, but you give them to people in your hood. That's what we used to do. We used to make tapes and have 4 or 5 songs on a tape and would go around and just give copies to people. Now, mind you, 4 or 5 songs is not a lot of time on a tape. So you literally have like the 60-minute, 90-minute tape. And we used to give these tapes away for like 4 or 5 songs, So it's just wild thinking back on those days. But those tapes were a lifeline for us to be able to start making music. And that sort of cued me into the recording process. And then when we moved up to other equipment, when we recorded music at a later time, then he got a 4-track recorder, a digital recorder. That made recording music a lot easier than going back and forth between tapes on the tape deck, which if you messed up, you had to stop and go all the way back over again. All the way from the beginning if you messed up. So you got really good at being able not to mess up. And then, of course, the biggest thing what we use blank cassette tapes for, getting a dub of an album. And everybody has done this. And this was really big right around the time we were coming up. Now, obviously, you would have the people that would go to the record stores and would get the tapes. And, tapes were the predominant thing during that time, at least in the early 90s and the mid 90s. And people were getting CDs, but probably not in a large number until maybe the mid 90s into the late 90s. Like CDs as a medium were starting to come around, 80s, maybe early 90s. But tapes were still predominant around that time. And you would have somebody that would go out there and get a tape and, they would play that tape in their Walkman. And sometimes you'd want to be able to have that album too. Well, for a lot of us, we either didn't have the money to be able to go get them or our parents weren't going to take us to go get those albums. So the next best thing that you could do was to be able to go get a blank tape of your own. And if it was your homeboy or somebody at school you were cool with, then it would be like, hey, this tape is dope, it's slamming, this is, in DC we said the tape crank, and it'd be like, hey man, let me get a dub of that junk, I'll give you a blank tape after lunch. And that's what it was. You get a blank tape, and for the most part it was sort of like, trade for trade. I mean, back then the tapes were the currency. That's what we had. The blank tape was something in order to be able to get something that we wanted. Now, if you did something like this and got a dub from somebody of a tape that you wanted, then it was to be expected that eventually if you had something that person wanted, then you would give them a dub back in return of something that you had that they wanted to listen to. That's really how we did trade for trade back then. We weren't really exchanging tape for money or anything like that, at least not in the early days. And that was critical because for a lot of the music listening that I did on my own, outside of anything that my sisters were listening to or my older cousins or my dad or my mom listening to vinyl, a lot of it was on these dubbed cassette tapes of albums and some of them dubs of singles. So you would sit there and you would see, certainly, eventually you have like a shoebox full of tapes. I remember my first shoebox full of tapes I had accumulated at least by middle school. By the time I got to high school, those shoeboxes became like 3 shoeboxes. And when you get a shoebox of those tapes, they're always a mess. I mean, they're never really neatly stacked together. You pretty much improvise with storage the way that you had it. Some people had the tape holders where they can neatly stack the tapes in, like you could, sort of insert them in, like you had the CD towers that they had, you would have the tape towers and you could neatly stack your tapes in there. If you would put them in this shoebox, it was, sometimes you were not neatly putting things back. And then that creates a problem when you go in that shoebox to try to find a cassette that you're looking for of something that you want to play. So it became a bit cumbersome, but nonetheless, though, you accumulated a lot of music that way. Now, personally, even going back to us in the DC area, with us, go-go tapes were the thing. So bands would put out tapes, they called them PA tapes. And eventually we had a store called PA Palace that put out go-go tapes that would sell the go-go tapes that the bands would put out, where they would record the shows, various shows around the venues, around DC, around the area. And basically you would identify the tapes by the name of the band and then the date afterwards. So for me, the big bands when I were coming up, obviously were bands like Rare Essence, Junkyard Band, Backyard Band, Pure Elegance, Northeast Groovers or NEG, EU with Sugar Bear. I mean, so many different bands that were out there during that time. But if you were going and looking for a tape, you would go to PA Palace. And PA Palace, you would look at these tapes and they would have like these, special markings on them and special covers on the tape that where it would say, the name of the band, the date, and then also the venue where they played at. So, for instance, if I was going to PA Palace and we had a couple of stores, Prince George's Plaza, also Capitol Plaza here in Prince George's County where I lived at, you would go and look for something like, hey, I'm looking for a Backyard Band 7-3-97. I mean, it was recorded on July 3rd, 1997 at the Met. Or you would be like, hey, I'm looking for that Junkyard Band 3/31/96 recorded at the Ibex. And you would see all these tapes there, and you would cop a certain amount of tapes if you had money to go cop tapes. And everyone at every school in Prince George's County, in DC, wherever you were, had that one person or two people in the school that had an endless amount of PA tapes. And sometimes they got them from PA Palace, and sometimes they got them from elsewhere. Well, that was a big thing back then, too. It's going to get dubs of go-go tapes. And that sometimes would have to come for an exchange of not just a tape for tape, but then even sometimes, because go-go tapes were probably more of a rare find back then in DC, you had to go to PA Palace or you had to get a dub from somebody. Then it meant that you also had to probably give a few bucks up. And sometimes it would be a small amount of change. It might be $5, might be, whatever you could scrounge up, $2 to $5. Sometimes with the really good tapes later on, if you got a dub of a tape from somebody, maybe you were paying like $10. I'm not saying whether that was right or wrong, but that's just the way that things happened back then. So you would have another accumulation of tapes. So mixed in with my hip hop tapes also were some go-go tapes. Now with go-go, it was a little bit easier for my parents to understand because they really weren't understanding what was being said on some of the tapes sometimes. But I also had to be very careful what I played out loud, just like on my hip hop and rap tapes. So yeah, that's what we did. And getting a dub was important as a hip hop fan because that would sort of mirror what we did later on in life. Now, the tapes would then go on and move to CDs, and, we'll have another episode we talk about CDs, but that was a big thing. But then another thing that happened as well was the peer-to-peer file sharing, things that started primarily with some networks that started online, but really became popular with the advent of Napster near the end of the 20th century. And then by the time you got into the 21st century, when I was in college, well, file sharing became a really big thing. And then, you talk about what Kazaa and LimeWire and SongSpy and Audio Galaxy and eventually, those type of, file sharing clients that eventually we know are now pretty much most of them dead and gone. And, it's sort of a thing of the past now. Well, at least on the surface of the internet, it's a thing of the past. But really, when you think about it, man, those cassette tapes were really the beginning of what was peer-to-peer file sharing, because that's what you were doing. You were taking music and recording it for somebody else and giving them something which you had. Very, very similar to the process of doing what we did in Kazaa and SongSpy and Audio Galaxy and LimeWire. We really just did it analog. And to me, I think there was almost an appreciation that you had when somebody gave you a dub because, in the early days, you would have to record a tape and let it play all the way through. But then eventually later on, we had the speed dub where it would allow you to record in half the amount of time. But still, it was an effort for somebody to go through and record and dub a tape for you because that meant they'd take some time out to be able to do that for you. And for real, if somebody did it and they did it for free because they were expecting something back a little bit later, I mean, hell, those were the good times back then. And really, I credit those tapes that I had to really mold me to become the hip-hop fan that I am today. And anybody who came up during that tape era, we remember it, man. It was really, really cool. It didn't matter whether it was Memorex or TDK or Maxwell or Sony. As long as you had a blank tape, you could roll, man. And I still have a very small collection of tapes. Now, I lost everything that I had in the fire in 2016, and I lost a large part of my CD collection back then and also a lot of my tapes. But thankfully for me, I had some tapes in my storage in my place below where I lived at, so I was able to salvage some of my tapes. So I'm thankful that I still have them. I have something to play them on, but I haven't played them in a while. I think I'm kind of scared to pull them out at this point because I don't want those tapes to break. So I know that if I can listen to that music, man, but sometime it was something about just being able to press play on that Walkman or that boombox or whatever it was you were playing it out of, man, to hear that sound that you got from that tape. It was just awesome. And so those of us who came up during the tape era, we know it's a relic of the past, but hey, vinyl made a comeback. Who knows? Will tapes make a comeback too? You never know. Some people think that vinyl wasn't going to be able to make a comeback, and now it's made quite the strong comeback and is still on the way back. So maybe we'll see tapes make a comeback too. I don't know. The streaming era has made things very easy to listen to, but it's fun to reminisce about. So the blank cassette tape era, y'all. You had to be there to sort of experience it. And that is another Relics of the Past. And of course, that is another bonus edition of The Vault. Please make sure you check us out on our host on Red Circle. You can also visit us at vaultclassicpod.com. That's vaultclassicpod.com. You can go there, listen to all of our episodes, write a review, rate the show on the website. You can also leave a voicemail. Also, you can go there and donate to our Buy Me a Coffee, and also check out the rest of the website. You can also reach our private Facebook community by clicking on the links, and it will take you there to the private Facebook community where you can join the Vault Podcast Record Club and go in there and interact with us to see about all the things that we're talking about. We got some great things coming up later on this year for all of that. We appreciate the support, and if you have a friend, tell a friend, and make sure that that friend tells a friend. Always remember to keep your headphones on and your music loud, but not too loud. And as we close, we'd like to remind everyone to dream big, because dreams are the basis for creation. Always create, motivate, and elevate, because you are never destined or created to stay stationary in this life. And on that note, we say peace.
Thank you for listening and coming into The Vault. Please subscribe and visit us at vaultclassicpod.com. That's vaultclassicpod.com.